Hello and welcome to Keep Growing Detroit's Let It Rot Basic Composting class. Today we are excited to have Ricky from Scrap Soils sharing his expertise with all of you. This class is perfect for beginners who want to learn the art of composting, reduce waste, and give back to the environment. Our class is free to attend, but donations are always appreciated to support our ongoing community programs. To donate, simply scan the QR code displayed on your screen. Also, please take a moment to note the valuable information on the slides currently being shown. Now, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Ricky and open up the space for him to begin. Take it away, Ricky. All right, there we are. There we go.
Okay. Okay, so again, thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Ricky Blanding. I am the executive director of Scrap Soils. We are a Detroit-based composting nonprofit focused on residential and commercial food waste pickup, and we compost that waste. And today we're going to go into the basics of how to compost your waste if you don't have access to a service like ours, or even if you just want to do it alone. Again, thank you so much to Keep Growing Detroit for having us here. So before we get into it, just wanted to kind of place some thoughts in everyone's head. Wanted to remind you that food is an exchange of life between us and the soil. If we don't return that food back to the soil, we lose life. It's important to know that we are a part of a massive cycle. Everything around us is happening in process, and this world has allowed us ways to kind of exit that process sometimes, but we have to find a way to keep on putting that energy that's a gift to us through food back into the soil. And today we're going to learn that. Ready? And so in just districts 3 and 6, there's 580 million pounds of food waste residentially alone that's landfilled each year. And I just want you guys to think about how much food waste that is. Like, you kind of can't imagine, how much food waste it is. But furthermore, imagine how much of a benefit it would be to the soils that are literally turning into desert due to industrial farming. Imagine if we took just a fraction of that waste and we started to compost it. So when you all start your own compost piles and along with Scrap Soils and all of the other organizations doing this work, this is not too big of a number for us to manage in terms of composting. So some more thoughts to keep in mind. Pull it all back. Compost is about more than cleaning up your mess. It's a natural part of life that we don't always allow to happen. And then habit, getting into the flow of saving your food waste. It just feels right. Compost gives so much more than it takes. And by that, I mean, composting it's fun. And it's like taking out the trash, like you do it all the time. And so when you take that first step to get acclimated to doing this process, whether it be just delivering your food waste to an organization like ours or doing the composting yourself, you'll notice that a little effort goes a really long way. Okay, so for section 1, compost, the what and the why. Yep, and I think also, Naja, there was yep. So the basis of composting, it's an organic material that can be added to soil to help plants grow. Food scraps and yard waste together currently make up more than 30% of what we throw away. And we saw that reflected in that 580 million pound figure. And all this can be composted instead. Making compost keeps these materials out of the landfills where they take up space, release methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. So to give you all an idea, methane is like way, way more harmful, like per particle, than like carbon dioxide. And I know carbon dioxide usually is the big scary word that people keep hearing, but methane is even more harmful than that. And in terms of the greenhouse gas issue. And so food waste is definitely something we want to manage. So let's talk a little bit about why we should compost. Compost is a fertilizer. Compost, yep. Sorry, okay. Yep, so yeah, compost is a fertilizer. This compost is something that is brown and sometimes is like a blackish, sweet, earthy smell. And it allows plants to grow much healthier and be much more full of nutrients than they would be had we grown it with just normal run-of-the-mill soil. There's a few different types of compost. So compost that uses things like yard thatch, which is your weeds and well, hopefully not weeds, but your grass and your leaves and sticks and twigs. That type of compost gives a different benefit than bacterial-based compost, which is what we're going to be learning today. Compost also combats climate change. The healthy plants in the soil have what they need to more efficiently absorb that GHG. Naturally, plants breathe in these harmful gases that we're trying to not have as much of in our atmosphere. So naturally, by giving them what they need to live strong, we're allowing a natural part of life to do this work for us. And then resilience to climate change. Soil and compost, or compost in soil, it makes the soil stronger. So when erosion happens, which we'll talk about a little bit, when other parts of just the natural process happen, and especially as climate change continues to keep coming at us, strong soil is one of those things that's going to help that issue not make as much damage. So we're going to talk a little bit about soil erosion in a little bit too here. So here's some examples. Erosion, which is that picture to the left. These are, I believe, corn plants. I believe they're corn. And if you can see, there's the soil that they're planted in, but then the water has completely run away and it has made this kind of like muddy, sandy patch right next to it. And some of the roots are exposed. This is a natural process called erosion. And it happens because the soil that the plants were in did not have enough life in it and enough what we call mycorrhizae and bacteria and all the right components and balance to hold together and stand up against the water that was washing the soil away. Up there, you see a picture of some really healthy food. It's beautifully arranged, but I think you'll notice that when you're growing food with healthy soil, what you're getting back is really, really potent and nutritionally dense. And then lastly, at the bottom here, we just have some finished compost. It is, I'm not sure if any of you have ever like actually worked with a pile before or seen compost maybe on a farm, but you can feel and see and smell the difference in the health of the soil. And there's all types of benefits that we'll get into today that is very different and superior to just dirt, as they would say. Okay, so what is compost? Compost is a microbiome, right? I want you to think of compost as a family of organisms dedicated to giving life. And so it starts off with 3 parts carbon, which is going to be your wood chips, your cardboard, your leaves, and your paper. Anything that's carbon based that doesn't have a chemical or waxy coating. I know a lot of people don't like to use certain types of paper that has ink in it. What's most important is that you focus on whether or not the paper has a waxy coating. So you don't want to use things like magazine paper or anything with like a plastic liner. And then it's going to be 1 part nitrogen. So that nitrogen we're going to use food waste because that's what we're really trying to minimize right now. But you could also use leaves, yard thatch, manure. All of these things come together to make up the 1 part nitrogen piece. These 2 pieces work together in the compost because they are the home and the food of that microbiome. So you have nematodes and you have worms and all of these things that bring that compost together. If they don't have enough food in the nitrogen or enough carbon to live in and also eat as roughage, they won't be able to grow and produce compost. And then also we have compost needs to be dampened and needs to be aerated. Making sure that you're dampening your browns. So dampen your cardboard, your wood chips, and making sure that your compost maintains a certain level of fluffiness. We do this by turning, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But you always want to make sure that your compost is damp. I'll show you a way to like see what too wet and not wet enough is, and make sure it remains turned. If this doesn't happen, your compost will go into a process called anaerobic composting, which is a suffocated family of biology. And when that family suffocates, bad bacteria grow and it's not the same anymore. So we want to make sure we're turning. So this is just another example to show you all the composition of compost. Is mainly, like I said, 30% carbon, and excuse me, that figure is actually supposed to be reversed. It's going to be 30% nitrogen and 70% carbon. And you'll see that I'm going to do a live demonstration here today, kind of a mini demonstration, but you'll see that I'm using mostly the wood chips and the papers. And then the food waste is going to be layered on top of that like lasagna, along with a couple of other ingredients. Okay, and we're just getting back here one
Hold on
second.
1 second. Something just happened. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're back.
Okay. And then also, Naja, in our next break, we're going to switch. And so I'm going to do the presentation and we'll switch this so I can keep clicking, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Yes, so again, here's some examples of those 3 elements. We have carbon, the elements, and nitrogen. So I mentioned the woody materials that give the microorganisms the roughage they need to digest the food waste. The elements, which is the organisms that transform the waste into compost. Water and air are 2 of the main base elements, but the sun and the wind, and just by the compost being outside, there's so many amazing parts of just being outside that we don't get to see and interact with. But allowing nature to do its job is a part of this process. And then nitrogen, the food waste, that yard thatch and manure, all of this acts like food to the microbiome. And we can talk a little bit about manure right now. Manure, you can use cow manure, chicken manure, fish manure, which is really good stuff. But all of these, you want to make sure that you get it from, dare I say, credible source. You don't just want to take fresh manure and put it straight into your compost. Personally, I don't know, and you'll hear me say this through the presentation. I've done compost for years, but I'm also still learning. And I actually hope that I continue to learn until until I'm not able to compost anymore. But yeah, you want to make sure that your manure is either aged or from a clean source so that none of the animals that are contributing to that material were diseased in any way. Yep, so use food waste as a nitrogen source. This is just an example of some of the food that we can use. So by food waste, I know sometimes people get a little confused. They're like, well, can I put my old cheese in it? And the answer is depending on the type of compost organization you're working with, sometimes you can put things like milk and bones and meat into that process. But the main thing is you want to focus on fresh materials. So like your banana peels that went bad, your apple cores, your spinach that's spent, any type of food that you would have in your refrigerator that was fresh and that went bad, that is great for composting. Also bread, what do they call it? Eggshells, all of that is really good for compost too.
All right. That was awesome. So this is the end of this first section. We do have a few questions about some of the things you just mentioned. So I will give you those questions and we will move on from there. So the first
Okay.
one is wondering about solutions for composting in urban neighborhoods in a way that does not support a rat population. Do you have any recommendations for that? That's a question for me as well.
Yeah. So you're saying like, okay, this neighborhood is prone to having lots of rats. How do we do compost here?
Yes. How do you
Was that
deter the rats? Like, what is the best way to compost and not attract or keep them out of your
so
compost
just to
basically?
yeah. So just to back up a little bit, like rats and pests are attracted to rotting food. They are attracted to the smell. I think some of them might be able to like feel it out. They got extra senses we don't have. So when you're doing compost properly, you usually don't have that type of issue. If you're turning your compost pile regularly, if you're monitoring that temperature and making sure that food is breaking down, they aren't as attracted. They also can't make homes inside of the compost because you keep disrupting the structure of it all the time, which you're supposed to do. So it won't support them. If you have specifically like a rat problem or a pest problem in your backyard, honestly, I'm not sure what we would do about that. I've never had a pest issue. I have composted multiple sites around Detroit, all of which I'm sure have had some level of pest, and I've never had a pest issue.
Hmm.
And that was because I was following the steps, monitoring the temperature and moisture, and turning regularly.
Okay.
I will say, just for extra security, you could not have an open pile, so you could have some type of closed pile, which, for instance, would be inside of like chicken wire, like you see right here. This stuff, I'll talk to you about it in a little bit too, but you can wrap it around like a wooden box frame, and or you could just put some zip ties on it and close it up as a circle and have your compost pile inside of there. Something like that will keep things from picking at it and allow you to help that issue.
Okay. Okay, great. Yep, that was very helpful. Great tips. So turning, just make sure you're maintaining your pile, and the chicken wire, which we'll touch on more later, is also a good tip. All right, next question. So you did touch on the manure. So you said cow manure is good. Also someone is asking what to do with animal scraps, from dogs or cats. No, that or you can answer that. Do we want to use dogs or cats manure?
So no, you don't want to use dog and cat manure. Just like human manure, I've been told that there's certain not pesticides, but there's certain parts of the natural process that dog, cat manure does not go well with this process. I think it just comes down to general health. And again, I'm not an expert in this part of it. I have heard of examples where compost piles were able to take it and it was not an issue. I like to think of it as backyard composting, keep it simple, food waste, right? When you get to a larger scale, that microbiome is bigger. You're going from a 4 foot by 4 foot cubic space, which is what we're learning today, into large piles, or in some cases, windrows, entire facilities full of these compost piles. And when you get to that temperature and it's that maintained, certain bacteria don't have time to reproduce, and certain bacteria, seeds, they just die off in that heat. So for our backyard purposes, keep away from using cat and dog manure.
Okay. So the next question, I'm going to do 2 more questions, then we're going to get back into the presentation, and I'll come back to the other questions that are in here. So the next question is, do you have resources that provide conversion rates and algorithms to know the percentages of carbon, nitrogen, and other elements that are being contributed by items in compost pile? Do you have access to that information?
Yes, so at the end of the presentation, you'll see a resources slide, and that will show you an organization called IRLS, Compost Council, the Compost Council, US Compost Council, and a few other resources that are dedicated to giving you the facts around very specific metrics of the proportions of what should be in a pile. So yes, we can go through those resources after the presentation, but they're readily available.
Okay. Next question. This is another question about manure. How long does it need to be aged? Do you know that? How long it should be aged before they mix it in?
I'm not sure. Again, I'm not an expert in using manure and compost. I don't exactly know the process by which they age it. I think normally farms and like specifically organizations do that. So I'm not the one to ask that question, but I would love to reach out to maybe farmers and Keep Growing Detroit and see who has information on the best way to do that.
Yes, for
I
sure. So
just
Oriana, I'm gonna keep your question, and I'm gonna take it back to the team at KDD, and we'll get that answer for you. Okay.
Thank you. And
Yep.
I just saw, I think it was Zaro who commented mold. And this is not my official answer, but I'm just kind of like tinkering with the thought. I do know that mold plays a big role in processing on like on a bacterial level, right? And on a chemical level. And so if there's any issue with certain manures having like bad chemicals in them or festering pests or parasites, it makes sense that mold or mycorrhizae would play a part in purifying that manure so you could use it for these purposes. So again, we all will consult the experts, but I think mold plays a role in it.
Mhm. Okay. So we're gonna pause the questions for now. Come back to some more after the second segment. You said you're gonna go ahead and share your screen. You don't need
Yep, I'm
me.
going to share my screen.
Oh, okay.
Give me just 1 second here. Alrighty. So I did want to hop back to our table of contents. We kind of moved past it, but like I just want you guys to know the flow of what we're going through today. So we just went through the first section, which is the compost, the what and the why. Next, we're going to go through compost materials, the basic needs of a successful pile. We'll go into the tools that you need, kind of review the main components of the actual pile, and just kind of talk about the way that we're using them. After that, we're going to go through making the pile. So you'll see me I have some live pieces of the demonstration here that I'll be able to assemble right here on this table, and you'll see me make the actual pile. Keep in mind, because I'm indoors, this is not to scale, but it is a real demonstration of the actual stuff you'll need. Then we'll go into compost applications, how to process the compost once it's finished, how you'll know it's finished, and ways that you can apply it once it is finished. And then we'll have another Q&A section that we can hopefully troubleshoot a little bit more, talk a bit more about the do's and don'ts of compost. I have some questions that I've identified that I keep hearing. And yeah, and then we'll conclude our presentation. So let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so compost materials, and excuse my background noise. Yeah, what tools do I need, right? So for your materials, you're gonna need, I'll go through the tools first and then the rest. You're gonna need a pitchfork. I say pitchfork and not shovel because a pitchfork is something that can really dig into all of these different sizes and particle sizes and mass and really move that material around. It also has such a wide working surface area that you can really move a lot with less elbow grease. When you're trying to use a shovel, you'll notice the size and the weight of some of the stuff I use today. It doesn't move as much. So, but also a shovel is always great to have on deck. You'll need buckets, 5-gallon buckets, 2-gallon buckets, but as you're moving things around, you'll notice it's just better to have one of those. Also, sometimes when you're trying to wet things down, or let's say you want to have your worms like I have here, you want to have buckets. A tarp, this is kind of, I wouldn't say optional, but it's not completely necessary. So when we're composting in the summer, in the spring, early autumn, you really want your compost to be exposed, right? I say tarp for places that want to, if you wanted to put it down underneath the ground that you're working on, or if you, for some reason, needed to cover it because of aesthetics, then you can go ahead and use that. If you were to cover your compost, it's very important that you somehow have it aerated. So you want, like, there's special composting tarps. You never want to completely suffocate your compost, because when that happens, just like us, if we can't breathe, we can't live. So we need to protect that life that microbiome at all costs, right? Towels just for cleaning, a wheelbarrow for moving those heavy materials, and a compost thermometer. I would say this is probably one of the most essential tools. Like the pitchfork, the buckets, and the compost thermometer, we're always using, right? That thermometer allows you to know the state of your compost pile. If you want to get specific, you can put that thermometer around different parts of your pile and take an average of what the actual temperature is, so you know what state your pile is in. In terms of compost, we've gone through this already, but we have carbon, nitrogen, water, and time, right? We're turning our pile every 3 days, right? Every 4 days. You want to make sure that we're really moving that material. But you're also turning in reference to when your pile is hot, like what the actual temperature is. And I'll go into those specifics too. Obviously, we need an outdoor space. Finished compost and manure optional. So manure really just kickstart things, right? As does finished compost, like that kind of kickstarts things. You can start a compost pile without finished compost, but you really want that in there to, I don't know if you all have ever used or made sourdough, or like made bread. Like when you put bread in, you have to have the yeast, and the yeast makes the life, right? So in a way, finished compost has all of the microbiome in it, and it's like planting a seed so that the biome can grow. Understanding the difference between not enough and too much moisture. What I like to say is if you take a piece of your compost and you squeeze it in your fist, you just dig up a little bit, wood chips, leaves, and all, and you squeeze it, and water is draining out of your hand, your compost is too wet. If you take a same dig at it, a handful, and you squeeze it and like a drop or maybe 2 drops comes out, that's when you know that your compost is around the right moisture. If you squeeze it and no moisture comes out, you can't feel any extra moisture around your hands, then it's probably time to wet things up a bit. You need to be able to actually turn your pile. And this is important because you could make a humongous pile, but if you're not able to turn that pile, pieces of it could go anaerobic and it could start to attract pests and go in the direction we don't want it to. So you want to make sure that you have a pile that's manageable. You want to have at least an 8 foot by 8 foot area to be able to manage this. And I say that because if we start off at the minimal surface of 4 cubic feet, you'll notice this in section, I think 4, but we're moving that pile over in order to open it up, and then we're moving it back. So we're going back and forth with about 4 cubic feet of material. So keep that in mind. So here are some examples of those materials. You got a pitchfork, compost thermometer, tarp, bucket, and barrel. Okay, these are like these staple items. And back to the tarp, it's great to have a tarp because once you're finished with your compost and you start sifting things out and you're ready to let it cure so you can use it, a tarp is great so you're not sifting directly onto the ground and losing that precious material. So tarp is really great for like the beginning, the before and after, rather than during the actual process. Alrighty, so making the pile. Before we get into this, I'd like to kind of pause for a second and open it up to Naja to continue having questions about section 2.
All righty. We're through section 2. We'll get into some more questions. We have a question about coffee. I'm assuming you mean the coffee grounds. I know a lot of people use that in compost. Is that something you use or recommend, or any benefits to the coffee grounds?
Yes, absolutely. So coffee grounds are great for compost. Like, they're really rich in nitrogen, and yeah, they're totally okay and acceptable to use.
Okay.
If you're not that you would have coffee grounds and cream together, but just keep in mind at this scale, we want to try to keep other components of coffee like cream and creamer and all that. Want to keep that out. 4 cubic feet is just not enough biomass density. It doesn't have enough heat to really cook through those other materials.
Okay. Good tip. So from Renee Howard, we have, is it necessary for the food waste to be cut into smaller pieces?
Yes, I love that question, Renee. If you have an apple that went bad, you never chopped it up, and you just threw it into the compost, it will compost, but over a way longer period of time. You want to chop up your food waste as much as possible, and you'll see me get into that right now. But everything is particle size. So if you gave me a sandwich as big as this room, it would take me longer to eat it. I will be eating it, right? But it's just going to take longer. So in the same way, those bacteria that we are trying to cultivate, we need to chop up their food so they can digest it better. Great question. All right. Did we have any other questions we wanted to go through for
Yeah,
section?
we'll go through a few more before we head into section 3. Odessa asks, is it true that what you put into compost is what you will get out of it? For example, if putting unwanted weeds into compost, will that create susceptibility for those weed seeds to reproduce or hibernate within the compost, then in turn creating a possibility of those weeds coming back?
So from what I understood, you cut out a little bit. You're asking if putting weeds into the compost will allow those weeds to grow after the compost, yeah, after the composting process. Because we're beginners, we're starting off, we want to make sure we're not putting unwanted species of plants into our compost. Fortunately, this process does, if you do it correctly, it is supposed to break down those materials. So it's supposed to break down those roots so they don't the temperature is so hot that they don't have a chance to live. They literally like heat up, and it makes the cell walls break down, and it turns those roots or those seeds into a breeding ground, a nitrogenous, carbonous breeding ground for that bacteria to decompose it and turn it into compost. So one way to solve that issue is to make sure that your pile is maintaining a temperature of 130 to 140 degrees using your compost thermometer. And if that's happening, then you should be breaking down those seeds. If you're going through the proper curing phase, you're not going to have to worry about that part, like seeds coming back later to haunt you, right? I actually do have a question for Keep Growing Detroit or any other experts around composting about better practices for curing. I understand how I cure my compost, but I'd love to talk more about the different curing methods and exactly what that finished result looks like on a chemical level, according to how you cured it.
Well, I would definitely take that back to our team, Ricky. We will find that out together.
Thank you.
All right, next up, Dr. Sean said your plants are beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
We also
Yeah,
have,
these are germinated.
oh yeah, DeAndrea asks, will it be better to put the food in a blender? Does it take food a long time to break down? You just kind of answered that, but would a blender be a good idea to put your compost in?
So you can put your compost in a blender. I mean, excuse me, not compost. You can put your food waste in a blender, but it's not necessary for this process. You can get away with just chopping your food scraps up, to be about 2 or 3 inches, or like 1 to 3 inches of size. When you're putting it into a blender, that's like amazing. And if you want to put in that work, then your food waste is going to really process quicker. You got to pay attention to that kind of pile, but vermicomposting is a great way to use blended food waste. If you're blending it, we can talk about this a little bit later, but spreading that compost over paper type pulp inside of a smaller bin, along with some worms, would be like a really great worm compost.
They're awesome. And you just mentioned vermicomposting. That's the next question. Zoro said, is vermicomposting good to deter rats? Would that be a good suggestion for rats?
That's also a good question. I wouldn't. Vermicompost is easier to manage because it's in a closed container, not closed. Well, it's in a container, right? And
Mm.
it's in a plastic container that is only exposed because you drilled holes in it, but not because it's like outside. So I would say yes, you can compost a lot through vermicomposting. You're dealing with, yeah. So I would say that's one way to not have as many factors and not have this big food scrap pile. Is vermicomposting. But again, mismanaged compost, whether it be vermicompost or the stuff in your backyard, which is what we're doing today, both of those, if mismanaged, will attract pests if they're outside, because they start to smell, they go anaerobic because there's too much moisture, not enough turning, and that's when your compost is not good anymore. So manage what you do.
Okay. The most important part, managing your compost.
Yeah.
Okay. So Erica Yelder, I'm sorry. When building a compost area, where is a good source or place to acquire pallets, something to use as a housing unit for the compost? I can help you here. I just came across, I don't know if you all are familiar with the Habitat for Humanity. They have a location in Farmington on Grand River, but they have pallets for $1. You can go over there, get pallets. A lot of them are already cut, so if you don't need a lot big pieces or you need cut pieces, they have those as well, and those are really good for building compost enclosures. And also, I sent out a link, and I'll include that in the chat on the KGD website. We do have a tutorial on how to build a compost enclosure from pallets. So I'll share that with everyone. And do you have any resources for where to get pallets from, Ricky?
I Let me look around. I know there's a few organizations in Detroit that specifically handle like pallets.
Mm.
I can bounce that back to you. I know a couple of the next cycle team members might have facilities that process the pallets. So I'll let you know if I find anything, but not off the top of my head.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So we're gonna do one more question, then we'll head into the next segment. And we have, this is from Rosalind Jackson. Can you use just paper and garden waste, like leaves, plants, etc.?
That's a really good question. And the answer comes down to the size and the type of garden waste that you're using. Um, if you were to leave, if I was to mow my lawn and put it in a pile somewhere, it would turn, but it wouldn't necessarily compost, right? But leaves along with a little bit of the sticks that you get in there, it makes enough of heat to start to turn. So if you were to use your leaves and your plants and all that, that would be a yard thatch pile. You'd have to just make sure that you're putting something that's truly nitrogenous into that, as well as truly carbonous. So like enough paper, I would say. Um, Again, I wanna again consult the experts about that. But if I didn't have food waste and I was only using yard thatch, I would just make sure I had a great paper source before I started composting and making sure everything was nice and broken down. And most definitely in that case, using fresh compost as a part of your process. It'll make it go quicker.
Okay, great. So now we're going to move into part 3, and then we'll get into more questions.
All righty. Okay, so I'm going to back this up here. Okay, so can you all just see, can you see me and the presentation, or can you just see me?
You and the presentation.
Okay. Okay, so what I think I'll do right now actually is I'm going to do the section on the presentation and then I'll show you the live demonstration. So how does it work, right? Green plus brown equals compost, okay? It happens when the right amount of water can be eaten by those macro and microorganisms and the right amount of air is in there so that they can all breathe. All of this comes together to make that pile happen, okay? And I want to drive back in. Compost is not a stinky, smelly, rat infested, pest infested situation. If you have your 70-30 balance, you're going to have you're going to have a great product, okay? All righty. I wish there was a way for me to take off this top section, but anyhow, backyard composting. So let's just kind of go through the motion here. First, you want to select a spot. We're all learning, but place your pile on level ground and not at the bottom of a hill and away from neighbors. This is because if you're, number one, if your pile is on the bottom of a hill or like a slope, whenever it rains, rain is going to go into that place, and you're going to be subject to erosion, which is what we talked about earlier when the elements kind of wash soil structures away. And so this needs to be an 8 foot, I would say an 8 cubic foot spot that is relatively level. Then you want to add your material. So you want to start off with your carbon. Okay. We're doing all of this in what I call lasagna layers. It's commonly called that, where you're taking your carbon in a layer, your compost in a layer, and then your food waste in a layer. And you keep on layering that up until you reach your 4 cubic feet. You can go beyond 4 cubic feet if you want to. Just make sure you're not doing so much that you can't manage it. But before we add that compost in the nitrogen layer, just that simple base layer, we want to water that down, okay? Some people like to take all of their carbon source and wet it down before they even start to assemble, and that will work, just so long as you don't have these massively dry sections within your compost. If it's too dry, it's going to take longer for those microorganisms to move through the compost. They're not going to be able to set up shop and reproduce, and your compost will not happen. Okay, so you have to make sure all components are wet or damp. Then we want to establish the pile layer by layer, 4 cubic feet. Then we're mixing the pile. So 3 times. So you want to every 3 days you want to mix your pile. 3 to 4 days you want to mix it and flip it inside out. So what this means is you have your mass, right? And you let it sit there for like 4 days or until your temperature reached 130 to 140 degrees. When you notice that, you take your pitchfork and you just open up your pile, right? And so you open it up and you set it to an area to the side. And then you'll notice steam starting to come out. You'll notice like a dark section in the center that's a lot hotter, right? And when this
What is
happens,
it? No.
yeah, so like once this happens, it's time to put your pile back, right? So you're putting it back to where the outer crust is on the inside of the pile. And then just keep on watering it, right? Keep on doing that squeeze test where you're trying to get, some drops, just a few drops out of a good squeeze of a handful of it. You'll notice that the center it turns darker, right? Sometimes you'll notice like a white growth around that outer, like immediately outside of the center. Normally that is mycorrhizae. It's a type of really good fungus that happens when a lot of wood starts to get into these conditions. There are some indicators that let you know if your pile is getting too hot, but none as good as just sticking a thermometer in there, right? All righty. All right, so this is a diagram of a compost pile. My apologies for all the words, but I'll try to walk us through this. So we know to use our food waste as our nitrogen. We know we want to chop it up as much as we can. We don't need to blend it, but we want it to not be entire apple cores and whole entire coconuts, right? So we're going to lay down a layer of large branches or wood. This diagram shows to remove the grass, which is an option if you wanted to. I've never had an issue. You want those materials at the base so that all of the finer bits up at the top have something to sit on top of, right? You don't want to have them be too big though. Like I've noticed that when I'm turning, if I have like flat out sticks at the bottom, when I'm turning, it's just harder to reincorporate those sticks later on. So, just maybe use a paper source like wood or something like that. Then you're putting your leaves or your grasses or your nitrogen source, which in this case is food waste, right on top of that, along with your finished compost. And you want to water that down. And you keep doing that until you reach 4 cubic feet. Alrighty, so before we go into applications, this is almost the end of section 3. I'll go back to this slide. I'm going to show you all how I do this. Okay. Okay, so Naja, can you all still see me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, we're gonna build a compost pile. Here I have, just some burlap on top of a rinkety little table, but here we go. First we're gonna use wood chips, okay? So when I say wood chips, I mean something like this, okay? This particle size is really, really great, okay? They're not too heavy and too big. They're gonna break down really, really well. There's a site called Chip Drop that you can use. It takes them between like 1 day and 6 months to actually deliver the chips. but it's a great way to get that carbon source. You can also contact any of your local arborists, and they usually are looking for places to drop their chips. So we're gonna put this down. This, I did another live segment and I had some food waste in there, so we got some food waste, but it's okay, all right? So we're gonna put down these wood chips. And notice again, I'm putting them at the bottom of the layer. I hope you all can see this right here. Are we seeing okay, Naja?
Yes, yep, we can see.
Okay.
You know what? If you unshare the slide and make your screen bigger so it can be, yeah, there you go.
There we go. I see. Okay. All right, I'm trying to get out of this right now.
Well, we see you, so oh, there you go. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm actually gonna put this aside. So this is a bit better, so you can actually see what I'm doing here. All right, so imagine this is 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot, right? This is my base. Once I have my nice wood chips all laid down here, some would like to water this just as it is right now. That is an option. But now I'm ready to go ahead and put my food waste in, right? So when I'm putting my food waste in, I'm making sure again that I have chopped it up as much as I can. And we're putting it out there, okay? This is where the 5-gallon buckets will come in. You'll notice that when you know, if you have a 5-gallon bucket, it's really easy just to put it in there over the week, and you just dump your 5-gallon bucket out in layers on top of your carbon, right? So in here, I also have some old leaves from a plant that I trimmed, right? I've got some eggshells. I have some peppercorns. I got some egg cartons, which is really good carbon source. All of that can go into the compost pile, all right? So now that we have our food waste, we're gonna go ahead and put in some finished compost. So here, what I have are actually from my vermicompost in the basement, but they are worms, okay? I don't know if you can really see them all, but they're worms, all right? So we're gonna put those in a layer on top. And again, if I were out in my garden, I would take this whole entire bucket and just slosh it on top, right? Boom.
Oh, I see the worm moving.
You see it? Yeah, they're worms, what they like to do is they like to huddle up into families. So when I put them into this bucket, they got scared and they like found each other and wrapped around each other.
Oh,
And so
wow.
somewhere in here, there's like a ball of worms, right? Whenever you're doing your vermicomposting, you'll be able to use that that thing that they do to your advantage to be able to move the material out and still keep your worms. Scrap Soils will be doing educational events for years to come. So we are looking forward to posting more. If you follow us at Scrap Soils on Instagram or go to our website at scrapsoils.com, you'll be able to see all of our future educational events like this one here. Again, Naja, I really appreciate you having us here. Thank you.
Oh, yes, this is awesome.
Yes. All right, so bam, now we have our layers. We call them the lasagna layers. And you see the worms moving around in there. We have nematodes, worms. We have some mycelia from mycorrhizae that were in the woody material. All of this is really going to digest all of that food waste that I just put down there, okay? Now, after this, we're going back to the beginning. We're putting another layer of wood chips down. Okay, and so forth. And just keep on going up and up. Okay. So that's how we do that. Now I wanted to demonstrate a little bit of turning. So say this was my full pile, right? And 3 days had passed. My compost is staying nice and moist, and I'm noticing that it's about 130 degrees. I'm going to come in there with my pitchfork, right? And I'm going to open it up from the top or from the side, opening it up into my 8 cubic foot surface area. I'm pushing that around. Steam is coming out. I'm super excited because I know that I'm doing something about my food waste, and I'm aerating it this whole entire time. What I'm doing is I'm letting it breathe, and all those bacteria are now finding new places to feed, right? I'm breaking those mycelial connections, and they're attaching to new pieces of wood, and they're breaking down new parts of it, right? So boom, now I opened it all up. Now I reassemble it along with, I'm reassembling it along with making sure that I'm always watering according to how moist it is. Boom, boom, boom. And I can't wait until the weather breaks so you all can see us do this live in an actual size. It's going to be great. But bam, now we have it reassembled, okay? Pretty much. All righty, so now I think it's a great time to go ahead and open it up for questions, okay?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
We'll jump back into the questions. I'm gonna jump around here a bit. You did just mention in this presentation here about having your worms, your in a basement, and someone did ask about overwintering worms and choosing worm composting. So
Yeah.
can you speak on that some more about keeping your worms and what do you do with their worms in the basement, or how do you go about that process?
So if I've got my worms in my basement over the winter, what that means is I'm trying to make sure they're not getting too cold. If they get too cold, those balls that they form are not enough to keep them alive, and it's just enough to keep them alive. Usually they'll go straight to the center, but they won't be able to eat and move around because the outer crust is frozen. So in the basement, it's usually kind of damp because there's not a lot of air movement. It's a little bit warmer. It's just a way to keep them around. And obviously the sides and tops of my container and bottoms are all perforated. So air is moving in and everybody can breathe. Otherwise, they start to climb out trying to reach for air, and it's straight out of a movie, and I can't stomach it. So we want to make sure that we keep holes inside of our vermicompost bins.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yep, yep.
Next question. Can compost be used as a barrier for weeds?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I'm gonna say no, but if you have, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to again consult the masters on that. But I feel like no, because compost is a life supporting, life initiating material. So why
Right.
wouldn't it support weeds, right? Like
When they see
some
weeds
weeds,
grow through
yeah, like
compost.
some weeds favor more woody soil. And so by food waste compost being more bacterially based, they don't like it as much. And that's some weeds. Or I'll say some plants rather, right? So I think it depends on the type of weed and the type of compost. But off the top of my head, I'm going to say no. It won't prevent them from going.
Okay. Now, a question from Oriana. What do you use to sift the compost?
That is a great question. So um I use my trusty dusty chicken wire, and I was supposed to have this all broken up for you right now, but here we are. I actually can I can still do just a couple more snips. But chicken wire is amazing stuff. You can wrap it around things. You got to have a little bit of patience to work it, but once you do, you'll notice that it's easy, right? So we got one more, bam. Right? So these come in large rolls. You can flex them and they keep their shape more or less. You can put zip ties around them and snap them when you need to open up the structure and put new zip ties when you need to close it. You can stretch it over like a crate if you wanted to and use it as a shaker. That compost will fall straight through, keeping all of those heavier wood chip pieces on top and those fine grits going through. This is kind of like the backyard scientist way to do it. An easier way that I've seen is they've just taken like a milk crate, a plastic milk crate with all the holes in it, and put some handles on it, and like put one of these just at the bottom, and you shake it, right, and it falls through. So that's another way to do it. And you definitely want to sift your compost because we're working with carbon, right? We're working with woody materials, and in the garden, um, generally when you're doing like, let's say, a vegetable garden, wood inside of the actual soil structure is not helping those roots move around. It's just too hard and large of a mass for the roots to break through. And the nutrients in there is not bioavailable to the plants, right? So some wood is good. And I think a lot of gardeners and composters will agree with me. It's kind of up in the weeds about whether or not it's really bad for the soil, but I would say move that wood out of there and reduce the finest bits of compost that you can, okay? And keep wood to being a mulch for the top of your soil.
I agree. Great tip. I agree. All right, next question. We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to go through a few because we have the time. So,
Okay.
views on composting in large tubs for family gardeners. Do you think composting in tubs is okay, or should it be directly on the ground? Or
Directly on the ground. When
hmm
you're doing it in a tub, it's just do it on the ground. You
yeah,
want we want the earth, we want natural elements to be influencing and encouraging this, right? If you got it in a tub, it's separated from a part of life. That's how I think about it. So you're plugging your compost into the natural process by having it on the ground. It's a little disconnected when it's in a tub. But if it is in a tub, that's a great opportunity for vermicompost, which is a different process that we can cover in another lesson.
okay. And Diane asks, are worms necessary for compost?
Okay, so you don't need to go and buy worms and put them in your compost for the process to happen. Worms will naturally become a part of your compost because it's outside, because it's on the ground. Worms will be attracted to it and they will start to move around. They are what's called, I don't want to say they're a macroorganism, but they pretty much are. They're a large organism and they are the movers and shakers. Their insides are full of all of the natural stuff that we need to make soil like a big deal, right? So, um, I am going to say that worms are necessary for compost, but that doesn't mean you have to go spend money buying them. Make a home for them and they will find your compost.
Okay. Yep, I agree. The worms will come. If you build it, the worms will come. So,
Mm-hmm.
so the next question, do you have any information or any knowledge about composting laws? Like as far as it has to be a certain distance away from neighbor's property?
So I am still acclimating to what the laws are. I know that there was just some legislation that was passed that helped us in this area, but here in Detroit, if you're composting residentially underneath, I think it's either, I think it's 500 cubic yards. Um, we can, we're like, okay, right? So this 4 foot by 4 foot situation is no issue at all for your normal resident. Where it becomes an issue is that if you're taking drop-offs, like if people are coming to your location with a massive amount of food and you're not regulated, you're having issues. If your compost is not managed and it starts to smell putrid, you can smell when there's dying microbiome. It smells bad. Um, your neighbors are going to start to complain. They could easily report you, and you could be harboring literally a methane factory, right? So you want to make sure that you're putting that carbon in there and turning enough so that that doesn't happen. But as far as regulations goes, Scrap Souls and Keep Growing Detroit can reach out to you if you reach out to us specifically and put you in contact with organizations that actually need help to push this legislation forward and make composting more readily available for organizations on our scale. But as a resident, you don't have to worry. Just take care and follow the instructions.
Okay, great. Good tips. Okay, next question. Should the cardboard and paper be cut in small pieces as well?
Yep, cut it in small pieces. And you know what? I forgot to show you all. I had a little piece here. I have literally just some Trader Joe's bags that I ripped up and I put inside of some water, right? So I'll take one of them here. It's all sopping wet right now. That is, you see the drips coming out of my hand? That's considered like too wet. I'm going to squeeze it until it's just right. That's about right. Okay, so we have it like this. About this size is okay. Okay, when you're putting it inside of a larger compost. So this is what, like 3.5 by 3.5 inches total. Okay, you can totally use this. And once it's wet, it's even easier to mix down. You'll notice too, once you start working your pile, just the abrasive nature of all those materials moving around will rip up and break those fibers and help you break it down even further. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, that was a question from, I don't want to, Dehara, possibly. Just let us know if they answered your question.
You did. Thank
And
you.
okay, great, thanks. Okay, the bottom layer on the diagram was wood, pallet, or large branches. Are these chips representing that? So the chips you use, is that representing the wood, pallet, or large branches in the diagram?
So that's a really good question. I'm going to say for us, as we're growing and as we're learning, don't worry about the large branches and all that at the bottom. You want to put down the chips like I did it, okay? Put you down some ripped up paper, some ripped up cardboard. You really want that down there. Something that's a little bit heftier for that first initial setup. And as you turn it, you'll notice how those things are starting to break down. But start off with something that is like wet cardboard essentially, or like a thicker layer of your brown, so like your wood chips or your cardboard, and then you can go forth building the rest with like normal size layers in between. And also keep in mind, in this demonstration, it was not to scale, so I didn't get to demonstrate what 70% carbon looks like against 30% nitrogen. But when you're finished with your pile, make sure that you have substantially more carbon in wood chips and paper than you do the food waste. Okay. Yeah. And also when we get to the question section, I hope you guys keep asking these really great questions, because there's obviously a lot we can cover. This is soil science we're talking about. So, keep picking my brain about it. And if we don't have time today, then you all can reach out to either myself, Ricky B at scrapsoils.com, or you can reach out to Keep Growing Detroit to keep getting these resources.
Yep. Thank you for that. We're going to do one more question here. We're going to jump back into the presentation. And then, like he said, at the end, there will be opportunity for a few more questions and answers. The question here is, what are your thoughts on, well, we kind of answered that already with the tubs or the ground, but what are your thoughts on plastic compost bins and tumblers? So I've seen those things at Home Depot, you spin it around and all that stuff. It's a big bin, it's plastic. Do you have any thoughts on those? Are those, worth the money?
No, they are not. Um, I just no offense to them, but personally, there is nothing like having a compost pile on the ground. You're looking at it, it's talking to you, you're talking to it. We got this. When you have one of those bins, that is somebody else's solution to doing work. They are so afraid of things going wrong that they had to put it inside of a big plastic tub and turn it. Now, again, if you manage that tub, then it will work and you will get compost. Some of those tubs are made to make that compost happen faster. Some of them work by anaerobic digestion, which is like suffocating the oxygen loving bacteria and allowing the oxygen non-loving bacteria to process, but it takes more work for that even. I'd say the easiest method is just to do it the way I've outlined it here today. And of course, follow up with other resources to fact check even me and make sure you're getting it right.
All right, great. Thank you, Ricky. So we can
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and jump into the next segment and we'll do more questions after.
Okay. All righty. So applications. How to use your compost. So compost is great for your garden, compost tea, vermicompost, and lawns. If you're using it in your garden, um, and by that I mean your vegetable garden, right? You want to garden in general, you want to mix it into the topsoil. Okay, so we're going about, let's say, 2 to 3 inches deep with compost, and we're just kind of like dressing it on the top. Even if you spread it around the top, just kind of take your fingers and fluff what's already there with your compost so that it goes inside of the just below the surface. We do that fluffing because if you leave it on the top, all of that air and sun and all of this is going to dry out the compost too quickly, and it's not going to allow it to really cement and inoculate the roots and get down in there. So we mix it in so that that top layer can crust over a little bit, but what's underneath is still nice and warm and wet enough so that it can continue to move and live and feed your plants, whether they be vegetables or flowers. Compost tea. This is my little mix of compost tea. There's so many ways to do this, but because we're using wood chips, right, and like really woody materials, we can take every 2 cups of we can take 2 cups of water, excuse me, 2 cups of compost into a 5-gallon bucket and then put a couple tablespoons of molasses in there. You want to mix that around for about a week daily. And when I say mix, I mean you're really turning it. You're trying to get some bubbles in there. If you have like a big whisk, you want to use that. I would say mix for about 30 to 60 seconds every single day for that. And what you're doing is really feeding the bacteria in there. And when it's a week old, you'll notice that there might be some white chunks in there around the wood pieces. That's really good stuff. You want to strain all the big materials out, and what you're left with is a really good compost tea. So you can water just a couple tablespoons of that over the tops of your new plants. You can water, like, it's really potent, right? So you can take, I don't know, a cup and put it into like a big flower thing, like a flower water like this, and it will really, really give your soil a boost of nutrients. Vermicompost, using it as a medium for worms. So I talked a little bit about this earlier, but if you had like one of those big totes for your vermicompost, which we didn't go through today, you poke all your holes and you have your paper pulp over to the side. Putting your worms on top of there is great, but unless they have something to eat up and something to move through, they're not going to be as active immediately. So using a little bit of finished compost to start a new type of compost process is a great way to use it. And then finally, lawns. Just put it out there, okay? Take some compost and just throw it out onto your lawn, spread it around, so you still see the grass, and water your grass. And just make it a part of nature again. Just return it. Like I said, the soil fed us food. Now we're taking that scrap and we're putting it back into the earth so that we can keep the process going, right? Okay, so Q&A. Here's some questions that I've thrown out there. And I want this to be like a little bit interactive, but I know that we are kind of coming up on time here. So Naja, I don't know if you want to allow these questions to direct the questions that we're answering, but how do I know when my compost is the right moisture? I answered this earlier. You take a squeeze of it. If a whole bunch of drops come out, if it's too wet. If just a couple come out, then you know it's just right. And too dry, you'll know that. So do we have any questions around determining moisture or watering techniques for composting?
Let me go through this chat real quick and see. We don't have any in the chat, but if anyone wanted to jump in with a question about moisture, go right ahead.
All right, again, do we have any questions about moisture? Are we clear on how to water our compost? I'll go over that right now again. I showed you this watering canister. You don't want to just take water and dump it in the center because then you didn't water your compost. A really good way is to water your browns first, saturate them, or at least have them be watered so that when you're incorporating it, it already has kind of water in it. Finding like a canister like this or putting your thumb over the spigot of your water hose, making sure that all those droplets get all over is the best way. If you dump water straight onto the side or top, you're essentially causing erosion. You're washing your material away and you're messing up your structure. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so next.
We do have a question about how often should the pile be watered? That just by testing the moisture content, or
So I would say by testing the moisture content and also by looking at the temperature. So Monday, I start my pile. Boom, boom, boom. I water it. Everything's great. I walk away. Tuesday rolls by, still looking good. And I put my thermometer in and it's still rising in temperature. Wednesday comes around and it looks like it's just still cold a little bit. Like it's not really doing anything. That's when I want to go in, maybe peel away the side, like a side, in the center layer and just kind of reach in there. If you feel any heat, you'll feel immediately whether there's heat or moisture in there. At that point, you'll know like, okay, maybe I should water it a little bit more, or maybe maybe there wasn't enough food waste in there. Maybe there's just too much woody material. Maybe things are too compressed. I'll circle back to this question. Somebody asked if they should blend their material. Honestly, for this compost structure, I'm going to say no, don't blend your material, because what that does is it compacts all the material together and it doesn't allow for enough movement. So if you're noticing your compost pile is cold, try to go back and make sure that it's wet enough, it has enough, your ratios are right, and keep moving forward.
so the next question about the water is how to preserve our pile when we get heavy rains.
How to preserve your pile when you get heavy rain. That's also a good question. The good thing about using wood chips and having like large enough particle sizes is that everything kind of sticks together. So like it will rain and your pile will still be right where it will stay where it is. If you arrange it the right way, it will do that. There are methods of composting where you can build an enclosure, like, 3 pallets next to each other with, you can put a special type of tarp over it. Using, like I said, the chicken wire, like 4 foot by 4 foot around, and curving it like this so that your compost goes inside, and you have like zip ties or clips or something closing it together like this. And so when it rains on this, the compost can't come out anywhere. Usually that kind of erosion happens if your pile is too spread out and it's not high enough, or if your material is so fine that it doesn't have any structure. But usually rain does not wash the compost away. And also flat ground. If your compost is on like a slope, the rain will affect it. So you got to pick your site the right way.
Okay, next water question. Is tap water okay, or is it best to collect rainwater to use on your compost?
Yes, rainwater. You want rainwater. Tap water is okay. I have composted, and a lot of the times I have used just the water from the spigot. But rainwater is the best. And I want to reiterate there. If you only have tap water, you don't understand rainwater, and you don't understand that part of things, you can still use tap water and you will still get compost. Just keep in mind that tap water has minerals and materials in it that inhibit the growth. They kind of slow the growth of these tiny little bacterial families. And so we want to give that life as much life as we can give them. And using rainwater is a very clean way to feed, that bacteria, and make sure we're not sterilizing them.
Okay, last question about the water. This is water in the leaves. Okay to leave the leaves bagged up outside where they can get wet. Need to be out in the open.
Wait, could you reiterate that? You said, can you leave the
leaves bagged outside? I keep them in a bag outside where it will be
yeah.
where it will rain.
So, I mean, if you want to, like, you could. I personally would bring my leaves inside. When you leave leaves out and they get wet, they sandwich together, they go anaerobic, and they start to decompose in not a good way. So you want to, already leaving bags of leaves to sit like that is not the best, because they kind of start to suffocate a little bit. But when they get drenched and they're compressing, it's not a good story. So I would recommend either covering your leaf bags or moving them somewhere that they're enclosed.
Okay. So that looks like that's it with the water question. So we can move on to your next question.
Okay. Okay. Your compost is done when it no longer maintains a temperature of 90 degrees, right? So you're sticking it in there. You're noticing that every 3 to 4 days, as you're turning, the compost pile is shrinking and it's shrinking, and the steam is still coming out and everything, and those bits no longer look like bits anymore. It's just starting to look like darker and darker. Your compost is turning into compost. It will maintain that temperature for a while, and then over time it will start to like not maintain that temperature. You want to let your compost sit for a little bit, just as it is, and you don't have to. Some people like to continue turning, some people just let it sit there. But when you're curing, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the temperature of your pile, and you don't want to cover your pile at this point. You just let it sit out. And if you must cover it from like the rain or the elements, use again that special compost tarp that is still breathable, or you can poke holes in a tarp, and let it sit for, I'd say, like 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, before you actually start to use it in your gardens.
Okay, do we have any questions on that about how to identify when your compost is done?
And again, I want to pose this question to any of the experts out there, or even to Keep Growing Detroit. I still would love to learn more methods of curing. So if we could, I will be following up with you about this myself. I have that question too.
Okay. All right, we can go to your next question.
Okay. Okay, so that white mossy substance is mycorrhiza. It is fungi. The it is amazing stuff, right? So I'll tell you guys a little story. Trees are able to essentially communicate with each other, right? And I obviously don't mean in a verbal sense, but the plants that are in your lawn, for example, like in your yard, they are, if they've been there for long enough time, they're connected by mycelial networks or mycorrhizae, right? These are a type of fungus, a type of mushroom, excuse me, a type of fungus that is underneath the ground, and they're wrapping around the roots and wrapping around clusters of things like compost, and exchanging moisture, exchanging sugars, exchanging electrical impulses, and all of this. When you have that white substance in your compost, it usually collects around the woodier pieces. It breaks down that wood and it brings nutrients into other parts of your garden, right? So whenever you see that mycorrhizae, which by the way love to eat sugars, that's why I told you to put a little bit of molasses into your compost tea. When you plant that and when you see that mycorrhizae and that white mossy substance start to spread, that means that you're cultivating that mycelial network, that underground fungus, and it's allowing the plants to do so much more than what they could on their own. When plants don't have a mycelial network to connect to, it's almost like being trapped in the middle of the UP with no internet. You're just up there, right? With what you know, and you got to figure out how to have fun. But when you're connected to the internet, now you can access whatever you need, and you can figure out how to cook your own food, and right. So make sure you're cultivating and taking care of that. If you notice that you're using lots of leaves for your compost, or you have like lots of food waste, or things, your particle size is really small, and you're noticing your compost pile is super hot and is getting like a white substance on it, but it's more like a white powder almost, that could be a sign that your compost pile is way too hot. Also, if you're using a lot of citrus, and you just notice like this smell happening, that's usually a sign that your compost is way too hot. It's a type of mold, and you definitely want to incorporate more woody material and turn your compost more.
Okay, I have a question about that. So if your compost pile gets too hot and it gets mold, is the compost bad at that point? You have to throw it all out and start over, or can you just add to it and fix the problem, or is it destroyed at that point?
So I would say no, it's not ruined. Compost is amazing because it's all you got to do is open up your pile again, add enough carbon in there, add enough carbon to absorb some of that extra moisture. You want to add enough, have enough fresh compost in there to continue kickstarting that process, and add some of that good bacteria back in there that love oxygen, and keep on with your composting process. And you'll notice that that mold will go away. Like, there's kind of essentially good and bad bacteria, and not to get too much into the weeds here, but if you follow the steps and you do that, the good bacteria in some cases will eat the bad bacteria. If you're not following the steps, the bad bacteria will grow, right? So as soon as you start following the steps again, even in the same pile, the good bacteria have a chance to grow up and go after it again, right? So I hope that was a good way to explain that. But yeah, like, your compost pile is not bad. Just add some more carbon and that should be okay.
Oh yes, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions about the white mossy substance. Has anyone else experienced that? I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for that in my compost this year. I do have a question. How do you use a compost thermometer correctly? That is from Deandra.
You use a compost thermometer correctly by, it's really simple. You literally just put it into the pile. So you don't want to, the actual node is probably like this long, like it's a pretty long thermometer. Insert it all the way in to the compost pile. You don't want to just like, you kind of always want to aim the tip of the node toward the center, I would say. So you never want to just stick it through the side, because then you're getting a reading on the crust. Try to get the tip of that node right into the middle of that compost, so you know at the heart of it, what is the temperature. I would also recommend going around your pile, stick it into the top and get one reading, and if you take 5 readings, okay, tally up all of your readings and divide it by how many you did. And if that temperature is between 130 and 140 degrees, then you're in a good spot.
All righty. Any more questions about the composting, the heating up process, or any of that overheating? All right. Go ahead with your next question, Ricky.
Okay. So why does my compost smell bad? Unbalanced materials, right? We either had too much water in there, or everything was broken up way too small and nothing had a chance to breathe. Fluffy, right? Slightly damp materials. We want things to always be fluffed up. If not, then we get crunched down, stale, not good compost, right? So the other thing that could add to this is, again, I said too much citrus in a small pile like this, it's so acidic that the bacteria don't want to grow, right? It's just so acidic that they're not able to do what they need to do. So putting your citrus peels and all that to organizations like Scrap Soils will allow you to focus on other materials that bacteria like to eat in your backyard. Also, I didn't put a question in here about pests, but if you're noticing like lots and lots of different types of pests inside of your compost, pests are a natural part of this whole process. There are going to be some critters and everything that you'll notice, but keep in mind that maintaining that temperature is going to get rid of a lot of these issues. Okay. And again, every 3 to 4 days, you're supposed to be turning your pile, completely taking it apart, completely putting it back together. That, along with the right moisture levels, will usually help with the unwanted smells.
All righty. Any questions regarding the smells? Has anyone experienced that before? If so, how have you remedied it? Any other All right. Do you have any more questions after this, Ricky, or would you like to go back into the chat question?
So that actually is my last question. This is an open
Okay.
question. Yeah.
Okay. So we do have a few questions still here in the chat from earlier. I'm gonna go back up. The next one was one moment. Okay. Do you have any tips for cold composting for less energetic senior citizens or someone with a back injury?
I would say vermicompost, because that's something that you can keep indoors. It's something that you don't have to turn as much as you just have to keep placing materials on top. So you dump something here, you dump something there, and you keep dumping on the next and other alternating side of the bin until some time passes and it's time for you to empty out one half and then keep on going. So I'd say vermicompost is the best way. Also, that's something that you can keep indoors and process a good amount of food waste. Like the way I process my food waste at home is in my vermicompost bin downstairs. But if you have a back injury, and you're a senior citizen, the other thing I would encourage you to do, depending on where you are, is go to scrapsoils.com and see if you're within our service radius, and we will just come pick up that compost for you. We'll come pick up that food waste, so that you, and not only that, but we have volunteer opportunities for you to actually volunteer with Sanctuary Farms, which, by the way, provided a lot of these materials. So shout out to Sanctuary Farms. They are on the east side near Grosse Pointe, east side of Detroit. So they're one of our main partners this year. But visit Scrap Soils if you can't do this process on your own, or reach out to us about vermicomposting.
Okay. Next question. Is there a certain layer you should end with? Does it matter how you end your layers?
I would end it with carbon. I would end it with something that is on the heavier side of things, just to kind of establish a crust. You don't want food waste just out at the top. You want to make sure if I was to come up to your pile, I don't want to see any food waste at all. Everything should be covered up. So, and if it's soil, you don't want that finished soil out there, because again, that's the living piece. Anything that's living or food needs to be inside. So I would say cover it up with either the leaves or the cardboard and paper or the wood chips.
Okay, great. Good tip. Next up, can you recommend any place to get a worm box? Are you familiar with the worm boxes?
I am not familiar with the worm boxes. Do you mean like a place you can just purchase worms?
Odessa, you can go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, thank you. So I've done worm composting in the past, and it was the easiest, zero odor, zero pest type of method.
Yeah.
And they break down the food scraps at a pretty quick rate, surprisingly. And so when I did it in the past, it was in a warmer climate, and they provided a special, I took it through like a Parks and Rec class. They
Okay.
had a specific type of box that didn't leach the plastic materials or anything toxic to the worms, because some plastic boxes can leach, right?
Yeah.
So it was a special type. I don't remember what that was because it was so long ago. And also a specific type of worm, because not all worms are the ones that break the materials down. And I forget which type of worm. So it's been so long, I've forgotten the specifics.
Okay. So I'm not familiar with these kits. I have gone to Uncle Jim's worm farm and gotten my worms, and I've taken them out of the bag that they came in and put them straight into my system. What I've also done, is taking them out of my compost pile. I've just taken a bunch of them. They're in a little family, and you will see them, and you just put that straight into your bin. Yeah, but I think that as long as you have like any resource for worms in your area, if you start a compost pile, you have them there. If you go to either Sanctuary Farms or contact Scrap Soils or contact Keep Growing Detroit, I'm sure between us, we definitely have worms for you. I hope that answers your question. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for the most part, yes. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time. How could I better answer your question?
I guess on the box, because not all plastic boxes would be necessarily good for the worms, from what I recall, because of leaching chemicals, as it
Okay.
heats up.
I see what you're saying. So that's actually a question that I think is better for somebody who is like a soil scientist. Me, myself, I've never had any issues with it. If your box, if whatever your vermicompost enclosure is wet enough, and if it has enough air holes in it, it won't heat up to the point where things are leaching and the worms are having an issue. You can use a normal plastic 5-gallon bucket. You can use a normal plastic tote to have your house your vermicompost, and you're not going to have issues. Issues come in when the worms cannot breathe. Issues come in when you just snap the lid and boom, or when you put in too much wood and nitrogen into that small space and it ends up actually composting and it gets hot to where they have to crawl out. But I wouldn't say you have to worry too much about the box itself.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome, great. Next question from Michaela. Wood pellets or wood chips, does it matter? Have you used wood pellets?
So when I first started composting, I did use wood pellets. And to be clear, we're talking like the pet pellets that come in a little rectangle, like little cylindrical pieces, and you put them down, and when you water them, they blow up into sawdust, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, that question was from, I'm sorry, who was that from? I lost you. Let's see.
Oh, can you still hear me?
Yes. Yeah, Michaela, she asked that question. Michaela, are you still on the call? Okay, we don't have Michaela, but I'm assuming, yeah, she's talking about the small wood pellets too.
Okay, so yeah, like for those, either is going to be great. I would go, if you have like a lot of those wood pellets available for free, then great, go ahead and do that, or like a small affordable cost. But they were expensive compared to just having an arborist or someone in my area with wood chips and using that as my source. There's plenty of places that will allow you to use like paper, and it takes a little work to break it down, but less cost is better. Wood pellets aren't necessarily better than the other materials. In some cases, they're not as good because the particle size is so small that it's really easy to make this compact, dense mass, as opposed to a woody mass with all these nooks and crannies for worms to make homes and climb around in. You want particles that are of a larger size. So like particles like this, you see, something that's about this size and that's firm, because when they get next to each other, they can't compress, right? But if you have sawdust, it just is compact. And that is anaerobic bacteria. That's the bad bacteria. Good bacteria love all of these tiny little nooks and crannies and spaces to flow through.
Makes sense.
Okay, awesome. Next up is, would it be good to start with chicken wire on the bottom, then add wood to promote air movement?
So that is a method. And if you do that method, when you're turning, you're going to have a really good way to move that compost pile off of that wood. Otherwise, that compost is always going to be falling through those nooks and crannies, and it's just going to kind of saturate that bottom portion. Me personally, I don't think it's necessary. When I am turning, I will say that it's really easy when you get to the bottom to start like digging up the ground, and you don't want to do that. So, even if you want something down there just to show that there's a separation between like the ground and the actual compost itself, then great. But yeah, I say it's not necessary. Anytime you have airflow, it is a good thing though. So I would like to talk to other composters and see what their experience is having compost directly on the ground or having some type of aerated structure below it to make sure that things can flow. I will say that the more air you have circulating around your compost pile, the quicker things can start to break down. So that is something to keep in mind, but it's not necessary for the compost to start. And I want to just back up a little bit and say to you all that this is a composting basics class, right? So we're talking about what are the bare bones needs of starting a pile. And this is so doable. Like you literally can do this. You can take this paper, layer it all up, and talk to Scrap Soils and Keep Growing Detroit about how it's going and get compost. There's way many other ways to do it a lot better and better and better, but to deal with the food waste and manage the food waste in your home, these are some steps that you can follow.
All right, great. Yes, thank you. This is basic, but it's a lot of useful information. Okay, next up, went through that. How do you? Oh, Sharon says she will not be squeezing compost with her hands. She's not doing that.
Okay.
And she said, is
Okay.
it okay if she just, smashed it onto the sidewalk to see how wet it is? I guess that'll give her indication.
No, we don't want it. No. Grab the compost with your hand. You can take a glove, a glove will work, but I want you to squeeze the compost. Okay. And if you're not able to, what you could also do is like take a bowl, right? Put some compost in that bowl and maybe take like a cup or, just like, I don't know, something, and smush it down and see if you can hear that water crawling out of there. You'll notice immediately if it's too wet. Also, if you're just digging through your compost with your rake or something, listen to it. If it sounds a little like wet, then it's probably too wet, right? But if you're listening to it and steam is bellowing out of it and it looks matte, like it doesn't look shiny on the surface, then chances are it's the right moisture. But of course, nothing is better than the tools that we were created with.
Yes. I know the feeling, that squishiness, but hey, you got to get your hands in there. Get your hands
You gotta,
dirty.
okay,
I draw
right?
the
Like
lines at the bottom, but I can.
I could not stand worms when I was younger. Like in a part of me viscerally still does not like them, but I love them now because I've been around them so much. And yeah, like you got to get your mind past like what clean means when it comes to the yard. Because like I said, like getting over those little uncomfortable moments, like, oh, I saw a critter or oh, there's a worm. And I'm not knocking you either. It is dirty. It can be dirty work. So I get it. But you'll notice that as you start to push past those personal boundaries, it will really be like, oh, like that's it. Like that's all I was afraid of. And this is what it takes for nature to do its job. It's a really liberating process to fall in love with.
Yep, I agree. All right, so Michelle is asking, do you do a separate pile for food waste until you have the right ratio of browns to actually incorporate into the pile?
So no, I would say if you don't have enough browns just yet, then you're going to want to try to redirect your compost to organizations like ours, until you have enough browns in a brown source to compost. If you start to accumulate too much food waste and you're letting it sit there in this hot weather, in this Michigan, it don't know what it is weather, then things are going to start to go anaerobic, and we don't want that. You can put your food waste in the freezer or the refrigerator to keep it until you get your browns, but you definitely don't want to put your food waste just in a pile until you have the proper materials to compost.
Okay, awesome. Next question along the same lines of sectioning off things and when to mix things. If you're using the three separate sections for composting, should we be starting all three sections at the same time, or is one section reserved for shifting the compost around?
So you're saying in the case of a 3-base system. So to my understanding, you're saying like should you start all 3 sections at once, or should it be successively moving through? Is that kind of where you're going with it?
Yes, I guess it's one section. Yes, yes, yes. Like it was one section for like the beginning stage. I guess the second section when it gets to a certain level, the third section.
Right. So you're moving from that first section, you're arranging your first pile, right? And during that turn, you're taking that material out and you're putting it into that next section, right? So you're putting that material into that next section, reassembling it, boom. At that point, you have the option to start a new pile. And then you're moving that material over when it's time to turn it again, and you're moving that material over, and it's kind of going through the process that way. If need be, some people will go from the beginning and they'll move that one pile back to the beginning section and cycle it through the same 3 bays until it's ready. Some people will have 5 bays and they will cycle it through so that by the time it reaches the end, it's usually done or ready for curing. But yes, you don't want to start all 3 bays at once. You want 1 bay going, and then progressively you're moving them forward through the system.
All right, great. Thank you. I'm thinking about using that system myself this year.
Yes, yes.
Okay, next question. Does scrap soils take drop-offs?
That's a great question. We're in communication with a couple of urban farms and some orgs that would like to compost with us, and hopefully we offer that option in the future. For now, we're mainly taking residential and commercial memberships. So if you're in a household in either districts 3 or 6, that's going to be like the West Village area all the way east towards Grosse Pointe, or if you're in the Brightmoor district up on the west side, then we will come to your house and compost with you. The other part of what we're trying to do is we want you guys to compost. Like we do it, but we want your hands in the soil. We want to make more people comfortable with grabbing the soil. We want that. So please reach out to us if you heard this lesson and you're still interested, but you just don't want to mess it up or whatever. Come out to one of our volunteer days. Volunteer with Sanctuary Farms. We are going to be doing a lot of work together, and do it with us a couple times and ask us these questions in person. That'll help you out. But for now, no, we do not take drop-offs. You'd have to be a member.
Okay. Next question. And we kind of touched on this already about composting in the winter. You were saying with the vermiculture in the basement. It's probably the best way to do it. Okay.
Yeah, I would
next,
say.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, you go ahead. I answered your question already.
Oh, okay. The next question was about different types of tree wood, like walnut and Atlantis trees, inhibit plant growth by causing an allostatic chemical response.
So let me see what that actual question is. 1 second.
Yeah, that's towards the end.
Okay. Okay. So I'm not seeing where the question is, but pretty much I'm not sure what the actual chemical process is behind like what's within those types of materials. So I can't say that they would cause a chemical reaction that would inhibit microbial growth. I will say if the material is organic and it's not poisonous and it is carbonous in nature and it has nitrogen in it, then it should normally be good for compost. I wouldn't shy away from putting walnut husks or other types of things inside of my compost. But then again, because I don't know for sure specifically what that material is, I can't say that it doesn't inhibit it. But I will say our members in our pilot program were not told to not use those materials. I saw many nut husks in our compost and we still walked away with successful compost.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. All right, we have a few more questions. questions? A lot of people are thanking you. They are really enjoying the presentation, which is awesome. We are glad they are
Good.
enjoying.
Yes.
Okay, last one I see is, what do you do about the pile over the winter?
So the pile over the winter, you can compost over the winter. You want to have a larger mass. So how do I describe this? A small fire is put out real quick. A big fire takes longer to put out. By making a compost pile, you're putting a whole bunch of tiny little bodies in one area, and it's creating a ball of heat, right? So in the summer, it's hot outside and it's hot inside, so everything is working. In the winter, it's cold outside, but that ball of heat is still in that compost pile in the center. So if you have a 4 foot by 4 foot space, that ball of heat shrinks. It's still somewhere in there and it's still composting, but if you want it to compost nearly as much material, you want to increase the size of your compost pile and you're going to do less turns. So over the winter, I would suggest maybe even doubling the amount of compost that you have. Make sure in the autumn, you're really setting it up to where you have the right levels of moisture and all of this. And go ahead and allow your pile to snow over, freeze over, what have you. And come the summertime or the springtime, you'll notice that the inside of the pile has continued to compost throughout that season. The other thing you can do, and this is the main way, I would say use your chicken wire or some type of enclosed structure like, pallets, three pallets surrounding each other, with some type of enclosure over the top. Having your 4 foot by 4 foot space inside of something like that will keep it upright and it'll allow you to cover it, keeping that snow off of the top of the pile. When you keep that snow off, it allows a little bit of an insulative layer for that material to stay at least a little warmer than it would be if it was in direct contact with ice, right? So putting it in a structure is one good way to compost during the wintertime.
All righty, awesome. Thank you so much, Ricky. And thank you everybody for attending this class. It was very informational. I definitely got some great information. I look forward to composting more. If you have any more questions, if you want to reach out to Ricky further, Ricky, can you drop your email into the chat so everybody can get your email? I also sent a link earlier that has Ricky's email information for Scrap Soil's website. Be sure to, keep up with Keep Growing Detroit. If you aren't a GRP member yet, please join the Garden Resource Program. We have a lot of resources for your gardens, family gardens, community gardens, market gardens. I saw there were questions about tools and learning different structures. We can definitely help you out there. So thank you all again, and we shall see you again soon.
Thank you guys so much for having me here. It was a great time. I look forward to hopefully the next one in the future.
Yes. All righty.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Gratitude.
Peace.